Islam is obsessed with controlling other people's holy sites.
You must not know much about Christianity then, my friend, because they did the same.
Just as Muhammad was obsessed with controlling other people's religious figures, turning Abraham and Moses and David and Jesus into devout Muslims.
This is exactly what the Christ followers did when they were looking to the heroes of the Old Testament or Hebrew scriptures. They saw Abraham, Adam, Moses, all of these figures followed Christ, and of course, are really technically Christians.
Toss in a bunch of later myths and legends and embellishments.
Sounds like you're talking about the Bible, because that's exactly what the biblical corpus has, and of course, outside of the Bible, we see a plethora of non-canonical material inspired by the mythic and legendary traditions we find within the Bible.
And convince hundreds of millions of people that they absolutely must preserve this slap in the face to Jews and Christians everywhere, and you get the ultimate monument to everything history's most obvious false prophet came to do.
Literally, Christianity has convinced hundreds of millions of people to keep their holy sites, their rituals, their belief systems, and such as sacred, not to change them. And, of course, you add in the little caveat against Muhammad, which I do think that he was not a prophet. You guys know that watching MythVision. But Jesus fails in his apocalyptic expectations as well. Failed apocalyptic prophet. This is 101. But maybe we need to do an actual deep dive.
To see the speck in your neighbor's eye, but to not see the wooden beam sticking out of your own eye.
The Christian apologist David Wood, as you saw at the beginning, is quite hypocritical in a video that he recently did, which got hundreds of thousands of views. Many people applauding, I'm sure, in the comments section on how you got Islam, and Islam's a false religion. Now, while I don't believe that Islam is true, neither is your religion. Christianity isn't true either. We are going to take a very fair scalpel showing David's nose, because I don't think he sees the nose on his own face. Stay tuned. Dr. Robert Cargill dives into all of these different topics that David brings up on his video. Almost every single one of them can be applied to David's own worldview. Man, those Muslims just can't stop copying Judaism and Christianity. As if that's a gotcha. You will want to stay tuned, and I hope you enjoy the video. Welcome to MythVision, Dr. Cargill.
Hey, Derek, good to be with you.
Thank you for joining me in discussing this.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Can you give us a real history lesson on the evolution of these religions? Oftentimes, Christian apologists like David Wood, whom I'm playing for this video, will point the finger at others and not recognize that their own tradition and their own religion is actually built of the same kind of components that they're criticizing others for.
Hey, this is a great question, and I think you know how I feel about apologists, and not just a religious apologist. They might be political apologists. They might be ideological apologists. They might be economic apologists. Anybody who attempts to shape whatever the reality is around them into what they already believe instead of vice versa. And that is the way we ought to do it. And that is look at the evidence that we have and then look for patterns or look for causes and effects or or try to look at the evidence that we have in front of us and to put together a narrative based on the evidence, not based on what we want to be true or what we already believe, or even worse, what we're told to believe by others. And if we don't believe it, we get our head chopped off. I have this thing with apologists. Everybody who, watches my channel knows this. I don't like apologetics. What I like is scholars who actually look at the evidence. And if the evidence corroborates a claim, say that. And if the evidence doesn't corroborate a claim, say that. And in this particular case, you've got a phenomenon that we call syncretism. It's a well-known concept in religious studies. And what it is let's say the incorporation or the adoption of previously held ideas into one's own religion or a new movement, something like that. And this happens for all religions in all times. It just does. Now, I can walk through some examples of this, but you just need to know up front that every religion evolves and develops over time. And I don't want to say they steal from other religions, but especially when they live in the same place, or they're conquered by another people, or they share a border. We call this liminal area, that border between areas. They tend to, well, what do you think about this? Well, neighbors who might not be the same religion, but they share ideas. And then over time, those ideas give rise to new ideas within the individual religious traditions. And then there's a fight within the individual religious traditions over whether or not that's orthodox, or whether that's possible, or maybe that's a good idea. We should believe that. And then there's usually people that respond against that. That happens all the time in all religions. Not only does Islam do that with Judaism and Christianity, which it admits to doing, right? Christians and Jews are called the people of the book in the Quran. So Jesus is a prophet, right? The patriarchs of Judaism are prophets according to Islam. So they don't understand them in the same way, but they acknowledge they revere them. They acknowledge that. So they incorporate this, is Abraham. They incorporate, where the Dome of the Rock sits today. All of these traditions they incorporate into their religion. Christianity does this too. Jesus is Jewish, and I know we have to talk about this, but Jesus is Jewish. He is playing into this concept of the Jewish Messiah. And so Christianity is a sect. It is an offshoot of Judaism. So there were Pharisees and Sadducees and Essenes and disciples of John the Baptist, and there were Herodians and all these different groups, people who followed the Enochic tradition, the Damascus covenant. There are all of these different sects that we know about from literature, from archaeology. And then there were the Christians. And these Christians were all Jews at the beginning. And they said that this one Jewish teacher, this rabbi, Jesus of Nazareth, he's the Messiah. And then he was killed. And then one day, according to the tradition, he comes back from the dead. And some people said they stole the body, and some people say he never existed, and whatever. The Christian tradition is that he rose from the dead, and the people who believe that he rose from the dead for the forgiveness of their sins, these guys who believe he's the Messiah become a sect of Judaism. Those Jews who were listening to Jesus but didn't accept that weren't. And Christianity went on to be persecuted and then become the official religion of the Roman Empire. But we can't lose sight of the fact that it's an offshoot of Judaism. And so it incorporated many of the Jewish concepts and then broke away from some of them. And so this happens all the time in all religions. If you look at the Sikh religion, sometimes called the Sikhs, right? The Sikh religion that's on the border there between Pakistan, in the Punjab, between Pakistan and India. This is a relatively newer religion. It doesn't go back, a couple thousand years, but it incorporates aspects of Islam, this monotheistic singular deity, with aspects of the Indian religious tradition. So it's not Muslim, it's not Islam, but it's also not Indian polytheism. It's it's a combination of both. It's a syncretic religion that then becomes its own thing with its own ethnicity, with its own people. And it's Sikhism is the 5th largest religion in the world now. And so this happens all the time. It's not just Islam that does it.
Based on this logic David Wood lays out, how Muslims copy the beauty of Christian art, it seems that Christians are guilty also of constantly reconsecrating temples that were dedicated to other deities and making them Christian. Technically, using the kind of rhetoric he does, they were stealing these pagan temples and their holy sites and controlling them for their gods while trying to convert the world to their religion. I'm sure we'll get into ancient Israel doing this with Jerusalem and other sites, but can we start here with Christianity?
Yeah, and again, as somebody who grew up in the Churches of Christ tradition, we're talking, little C Church of Christ, not big C, but it's the Christian church, right? And even the architecture, right? The idea that the cathedral, what we call now the cathedral, the apse up front, the kind of the altar area up front with the pillars down the middle with a higher roof and then the smaller roof off to the side with the pillars down the side. That was a Roman architectural style that just happened to be adopted by Christians later, and it became kind of the standard, what becomes now the standard for we now call a cathedral a Christian architectural thing. Cathedrals, of course, they're churches. No, that actually goes back to the Roman period. They adopted that Roman style. So the Christians were adopting Roman styles, the temples. Look in America, right? All of Washington, D.C. is basically incorporating the Greek style of architecture. Why? They were understood to be the first democracy, and we were this proud young democracy. And so we wanted to incorporate not only their architecture, but a lot of their symbolism. Look at the propaganda on our coins, liberty and the eagle, right? The all of these symbols for justice and egalitarianism. So much so that if you look in the building of Congress there in D.C., there's a dome. And inside of that dome, you actually have, I can't remember if it's a mosaic or a fresco, but it's a painting. It's a piece of art depicting the apotheosis of George Washington. That is George Washington, the founder of our country, our great first president, our leader, General Washington, who overcame the British and blah, blah, blah. He's being deified. It's an apotheosis, right? And this is just in keeping with the tradition of emperors becoming divine. It's when they're deceased, they're deified. And we're doing that in the dome inside of our own congressional buildings here in the United States. And so, ask Christians today, we're in the supposedly Christian nation, ask Christians today, is George Washington divine? And they would say, oh, no, I would never. And yet there's a painting of it because that's the symbolism. Jews did this, right? You've got a zodiac in the center of the Beit Alpha mosaic. And I mean, it's got the Hebrew letters, but it's got the zodiac. It's got Helios and the chariot and the horses, the sun. It was just part of the culture that you incorporate the previous individual cultures, the previous cultures' art, architecture, their themes, you incorporate that into your own tradition. And some of it is, some people are opposed to it. Oh, that's making our religious tradition impure. We can't have that. And other people are like, no, it's art. It's beautiful. And we'll redefine it and we'll make it into our own. And and we call it syncretism. It just changes. It develops a little bit over time because we're incorporating the stuff that previously existed. And this doesn't just happen with theology. It happens with architecture. So if you look at the Dome of the Rock, and I think this is what you're getting at, if you look at the Dome of the Rock, built in 691 by Abdul Malik in Jerusalem, this is not a mosque. This is a shrine. The mosque is right next to it. It's the Al-Aqsa Mosque, but it's a shrine. But Abdul Malik wanted the best architects of the time to build him the most incredible building to commemorate Muhammad's Isra and Miraj, right? The night journey and the ascent up into heaven, and he went on a divine tour. This is Surah 17 in the Quran. And he wants to build this over where, what? Where the Jewish temple once stood. So the Jewish temple used to be there, and it got knocked down. And so Abdul Malik is going to build a shrine on that same place. He's going to claim that place from the Jews using architecture. Now, here's what's interesting. That happens all the time. Holy places tend to remain holy regardless of what new religion or what new culture comes in. If something is said to have happened with the divine realm, some kind of theophany, and it happens there, even if some new religion or some new people comes in and conquers the place, it's the same reason why we don't mess with graveyards, right? Regardless of the religious tradition, if that's a dead, we're just going to leave that alone. We're not going to mess with that. In fact, we're going to leave that as a graveyard. In fact, if you build on top of a graveyard, that's supposed to be something that, makes you cursed, right? It's in all religious traditions. You don't mess with certain things. And so if a place is holy, it tends to stay holy. And so when I dug up at Banias, there was a tomb, and that tomb has had several different names because whatever religious tradition comes through, Muslims, Christians, Byzantine Christians, right? Different Jewish groups, now the Druze. That tomb is said to be the tomb of whatever religious leader from their tradition happens to be buried there. And the same is true with the Dome of the Rock. It used to be the Jewish temple, and now it's this place where Muhammad left up into the sky. What's interesting is he wanted the best architects to build it. So who were the best architects at the time? Christians. They were Christian architects. And so he actually hired Christian architects to build this. And what did they design it after? They designed it after these shrines to Christian martyrs, the martyria, right? These they're not churches, they're shrines because they're octagonal, but you actually see some more of these Christian shrines to martyrs in the region, right? And they just built, that's why it's octagonal. The Christians just did their best work, their best architecture, their best artistry, but it was built by Christians. But that doesn't mean that it's fake or that it's not real, because I'll draw you back to the books of Kings, where King Solomon is building the Jewish temple on that same spot. And who's actually building it? Jews? No. It's the Sidonians, it's the Tyrians, it's the guys with the lumber, it's the modern Lebanon, right? Look at the Lebanese flag. It's got a big cedar tree. This is where the best wood came from. They knew how to craft it. They had the best stonemasons. They had the best guys who could cut all the lumber and do all the building. So if you read in Kings, you can actually see where Solomon makes this deal with Hiram, I think his name is, King Hiram. And they agree, okay, you're going to bring the lumber, you're going to bring the builders, they'll work on it here with our people, and we'll build the temple. The Jewish temple in Jerusalem was actually built by Phoenicians. And the Dome of the Rock was actually built by Christian architects for Abdul Malik. So this idea that because somebody from a different religious tradition helped build a shrine for some other religion, that's been going on too for millennia.
So it seems that David Wood's logic here, Dr. Cargill, is that if we can show that a religion is copying and borrowing from other religions, whether that be Mesopotamian flood narratives or lifting from Canaanite and Phoenician ideas, or even imitating Greek histories or potential Greek mythologies to outdo those competitions, I'm wondering, based on this logic of borrowing and what David Wood keeps doing, if this falsifies his own religion, because this seems to be what they were doing as well in the literature as well as the archaeology, on the ground, the whole nine. To give one example of something that is imitating the culture around it, isn't the Jewish synagogue based off of a Greek meeting place?
The word synagogue is Greek. Synagogue. The word synagogue is Greek, and the architecture is this. It's a communal building with a bench around the side that was probably used for other things. It was probably a community building, a rec center. I grew up in small towns with these rec centers that had carpet, but they were also basketball courts, but they were also, reception halls. You had wedding receptions in them. They would be your voting places, right? You had these community halls, and then they just put a bench. You could sit around the edge, and that's where they would study, or that's where they would read, or that's what, like a library. And then this eventually became the architecture for a synagogue. But of course, it incorporated Greek stuff. The Christian cathedral was a Roman architectural design. So if you're going to argue that because the Dome of the Rock was actually built by Christians, hired by Abd al-Malik, the caliph there, who commissioned the building of the Dome of the Rock, if you're going to say, well, it's not legitimate because it was built by Christians, then you got to say the same thing about the Jewish temple that was built by Phoenicians and about synagogues and about, all of these churches. Who built something, right? Who physically actually built it together is not important. It's just not. It's what was the purpose of it? Who consecrated it, right? Who actually stood out there? What donors stood out there and got those big oversized scissors and cut the ribbon or smashed the bottle on the ship? Nobody really cares about the company who built some big giant yacht. They care about the guy smashing the bottle, the billionaire who bought the ship, right? Who's commissioning the ship. And that's what's important. How is the ship going to get used from that point forward? Because it was probably built by people from all around the world. And so it's a false logic. It's a false claim to say that because it was built by somebody else, that therefore it's illegitimate. Of course it's legitimate. There it is. It's standing there. That's what it's used for. That's just it's a bogus claim.
Rocks are very important in Islam.
David Wood is standing here mocking Muslims who admonish and admire rocks, yet Christians and Jews don't?
It's true that there's a black rock, probably a meteorite, which again symbolizes the connection between the divine realm and the earthly realm. That is, they're stuck on one of the corners of the Kaaba, right? They're in Mecca. Remember, by the way, this is a great example. The Kaaba itself used to be a shrine where all of the pagan idols of all of the various Arab tribes were housed. The Kaaba, before it was the central shrine of Islam, empty, because, there's no idolatry in Islam. Prior to it being that, it was a shrine in which all of the different idols for all of the pagan religions were housed. And Muhammad, when he went in there and threw all the idols out of the Kaaba, got in big trouble for doing that. And they chased him out of Mecca, and he had to go up to Medina and get some followers and then come back and conquer Mecca. At which time the Kaaba became the shrine to the one God, Allah, right? That same shrine. Places that are holy tend to stay holy. So he didn't destroy the Kaaba, and that became the shrine to Islam. So it's the same concept that the deities will change over time, but the places stay holy. So yeah, they venerate a rock that's been attached to the corner of the Kaaba, which is, built from stone and then has the cloth over it. But I mean, Jesus was buried in a rock-cut tomb, and that tomb has an entire church built over it called the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. It's a church that is built to venerate the rock, what's left of it, because people came, faithful Christians came to chip away so they could have a piece of the rock, not a Prudential commercial, but a piece of the actual tomb of Jesus to take home back with them to Europe. So there's a church that's built over both Golgotha and the presumed tomb of Jesus, but Christians don't venerate rocks. And Jews, you've got these standing stones, right? These matzebot, that every time that something would happen that they said was from God, they'd take a stone, stand it up, anoint it. Sometimes they'd plaster it and write the words of the Torah on it. On rocks. What else? The altars were said to be built from these 12 unhewn stones. This notion that only one religion venerates rocks, it's nonsense. You've got rocks in all of the religious traditions. And again, Islam's probably doing it because Christianity did it, because Judaism does it. They're just part of the Abrahamic tradition continuing this. So to single out Islam for doing this is to see the speck in your neighbor's eye, but to not see the wooden beam sticking out of your own eye.
That was an amazing way to put it, Dr. Cargill. I'm actually fascinated with this blindness that I find accusing Muslims of the rock at the Kaaba, and yet not recognizing that the Christians and Jews had the same well-established admiration for stones. Looking at standing stones in ancient Israel, all throughout the ancient Near East, technically worldwide, we find megalithic rock standing stones that represent something cosmic. Or take the language that Jesus is using according to the New Testament of being the chief cornerstone. He was supposedly a tecton, and if we talk to someone like Dr. James Tabor, he might even go so far as to at least speculate that maybe Jesus was a stonemason. Our own Lord and Savior was into stones. How about that? Anyway, I'm trying to make a point, though. If you don't mind, can you take us into this rock and stone thing deeper?
Correct. And I would say that it's not even a Jewish phenomenon, right? Prior to that, the Canaanite religions were standing up these stones. If you go up to Tel Dan, the bigger the stone, the bigger the deity, right? So you've got some short, fat stones, and you've got some tall, skinny stones, right? And you can look at and these are at the city gates, and you've got them at Tel Chatzor, and you've got these standing stones as representative of these Canaanite religions. And then you've got stories of Jacob, standing up a stone, and Joshua, when he comes into the country, standing up a stone and anointing it. So they're just adopting the Canaanite tradition. They're just adopting the tradition that's around them. You look at standing stones around the world. Look at what's done with stones. And I'm not just talking about the Easter Island heads. I'm talking about with pyramids, with ziggurats, in the building of using stones to build large, whether they be tombs or whether they be temples. It's silly, quite honestly, to mock or to attempt to mock, because you can't really do it, to mock one religion, to single out one religion as doing this, when this is something that all religions have done for all time. The whole concept of the Ebenezer, right? The stone of help in the Hebrew tradition, the chief cornerstone that is rejected, Jesus, that talks about the prophetic tradition in Hebrew. It doesn't make sense to call this out as something that is bad for Islam and then not recognize that it's in Christianity, it's in Judaism, it's in Canaanite religions, it's in every religion around the world.
So it's safe to say that David is being inconsistent by not applying this to his Christian worldview when he notices these things about other worldviews. I don't think it's quite fair.
Again, like I said at the beginning, when you do science, when you do any kind of credible scholarship, you have to find a methodology that is consistent. If your methodology is inconsistent, then whatever conclusion you draw from that inconsistent methodology is going to be flawed. And this is the problem with apologists, right? They will do these mental backflips, and they will contort themselves to try to make what they already believe in error to be true based on trying to fit cherry pick these bits of evidence and these bits of text to try to, and they're clearly omitting things. They're clearly, misrepresenting the evidence. A better approach, instead of going with the Bible in one hand and a spade in the other and trying to prove the Bible a better approach is to say, what evidence do we have? Start that way. Textual evidence, archaeological evidence, historical evidence from outside of the Bible. What evidence do we have? And let's piece together the puzzle with that. And then look at the Bible and say, okay, in what ways does the Bible support the claim that we just, let's say there's 3 or 4 different ways that 3 or 4 different scholars have put together these claims. Then you can say, all right, what are the ways that the Bible can be said to support these claims? And where does the Bible say to I don't want to say contradict, to challenge these claims? And then can the Bible itself be seen as a piece of evidence? Can we test the Bible? And this is critical scholarship, critical methodology. And you're not trying to prove the Bible. You're holding up the Bible as a valid piece of evidence that is also subject to be tested. And if the Bible, and I've said this since I was, for 20 years, if the Bible is what it claims to be, and if God is who he claims to be, he can stand a few hard questions, right? The Bible can take a little testing. If it can't, then it's not the document that people claim it is. If the Bible can't stand up to some simple questions, just some simple questions, then it's not the book that people are claiming it to be. It should be able to handle some simple analysis, from common YouTube creators, on the internet. It's just, if it can't do that, then there's a much bigger problem. And maybe, just maybe, all of this history of scholarship might have a point.
Why did Abdul Malik build the Dome of the Rock? Most Muslims are convinced that it was to honor Muhammad's night journey, when the Prophet of Islam was taken to the Temple Mount on a mythical flying donkey monster named Barak. But there's no evidence that Abdul Malik built the Dome of the Rock to honor the night journey. The night journey was apparently a later legend.
The inconsistencies just are very, very clear in this video with David Wood. And one of the things I'd like to point out as an observation is the donkey beast Barak, this wild creature that Muhammad rides on. And while he's being funny and pointing out how silly this human-faced winged donkey creature looks and is, how blind you have to be to realize that these same strange creatures and mythical beings are stuff we see in our own Bible. And in fact, I just want to highlight that it's not just in the Bible. This is all over the ancient Near East with these type of creatures. So if you look at it, I don't believe that that's literally true. The same way I would apply to the Bible and say, yeah, I don't believe those things are literally true. Let's be consistent here.
The Barak tradition is fascinating to me. I teach this in a couple of my courses. It's rooted, it's not mentioned in Surah 17. This is the Isra and the Miraj, the Muhammad's night journey in the Quran. It actually comes from the Hadiths, the commentaries on the Quran, the things that Muhammad was purported to have said to his closest companions about the Quran, his interpretations of these things. And the Barak tradition, now this isn't Barack Obama, the name, it's with a kuf and a kaf, or, in the Arabic equivalent of these. One means blessed, Barack Obama, and one means lightning, and that's the creature. I think that the creature on which the Prophet Muhammad sits when he's taking this night journey, and I'll explain the night journey in a second, is probably related iconographically to what we see as the Assyrian tradition of the Lamassu or the Shedu, or what I think is cherubim tradition in the Bible. This is a four-legged animal. It could be a lion. In this case, they say it's a steed, right? It's some kind of equine that's, I think it's larger than a donkey and smaller than a mule, or vice versa. I forget what it says, but it's got a face of a human and it's got the wings of like a Pegasus wings, like the wings of a bird. And if you look at the way the Lamassu is described, it's got this four-legged body and it's got the wings of a bird and it's got the face of a human. And you always find them guarding the entrance to something. You see them on the Ishtar gate. They're guarding the entrances to the city via gate. You see them on the temple. I think it was at Tel Tayanat, or was it Ain Dara? But it's been blown up now in Syria, but during the Syrian civil war. But you had them standing on the entrances to the temple. And of course, in the Bible, you get them talked about at the gates guarding the Garden of Eden. You get them talked about on the cover of the Ark of the Covenant, right? Facing each other, or the wings touching, something like that. where God will meet you in between the cherubs, right? Because they're guarding the divine presence. And of course, they're embroidered in the coverings of the temple, the cloths of the temple. And of course, they're guarding the entrance to the temple. You have them in the back there behind the Ark of the Covenant. So you have this tradition, again, in Judaism, in all of the Assyrian, you have similar traditions in the Zoroastrian tradition. So this iconography is consistent, right? It adapts and changes a little bit, but what's the Barak's job? Surah 17 says that he traveled from the main mosque there, the central mosque, the Masjid Al-Aqsa, to the mosque that's farthest from. And they're not talking about Tatooine, right? That's the planet that's farthest from in the Star Wars canon. They're talking about from the center of the Islamic world to whatever was the edge of the Islamic world at the time. And at the time, it was understood that was Jerusalem. Remember, because the Arab peoples originated on the Arabian Peninsula. That's their indigenous homeland, the Arabian Peninsula. And one of the first places they conquered was Palestine, was Canaan in the 7th century. And so they went to Palestine. Now, the Nabateans were there a little earlier. You had a couple of earlier non-Islamic or pre-Islamic Arab tribes that migrated up there earlier. But the Islamic Arabs conquered Jerusalem. Was one of the first things that they conquered. They conquered Palestine in the 7th century. And that means that Jerusalem, at the time of the writing of Surah 17, was probably the mosque that was farthest from. And so even though it doesn't say Jerusalem in Surah 17, it came to be understood that the mosque that's being referred to in the Quran there is actually referring to the mosque that comes to be named the Al-Aqsa Mosque, the mosque that's farthest from. They named it the Al-Aqsa Mosque. And so the tradition is that Muhammad went from Mecca to Jerusalem in one night. Now, how did he do that? He needed some help. And so he rode on the back of Al-Barak, and it says that his stride was as long as his gaze. And so however far he reached out his hooves, that was his stride, and that's how he could get from Mecca to Jerusalem in one night. And he was aided by these wings. Now, within Islam itself, there's a debate over whether this was a physical journey, whether Muhammad physically went from Mecca to Jerusalem, or whether it was a spiritual journey, a mental journey, and he just went there in his mind, or he went there in his spirit. There's a debate within Islam whether that really happened. Then, of course, once he's in Jerusalem, he goes up into the heavens, takes a tour of the universe, meets God, sees all these other people, and comes back all in one night. Now, if you hear that story and you live by the laws of physics in the world, you say, okay, you can't have hybrid mythological beings assisting humans going from Mecca in Saudi Arabia to Jerusalem there in one night. You can't do that. It's not possible. But then again, talking donkeys aren't possible. Talking serpents aren't possible. The sun doesn't stand still. You have all these things that are in the Bible. People don't come back from the dead, by the way. That's typically not what happens. And so you've got all these other things that are miracles that defy the laws of physics and of nature that happen in the Christian Bible, that happen in the Hebrew Bible.
It seems it's safe to say that even Yahweh rode on the wings of cherubs or on clouds.
Well, then, yeah, that's a good point. This is a great point, Derek. You've got this tradition as well where Yahweh himself is riding on the cherubs. We can put the verses out there. And I wrote an article on this for Bible and Archaeology, where you've actually got the cherubs, and God. Another article was written about this by Oded Lipschitz, the one of the best archaeologists in the world, right? Talks about how you have this tradition of God not only riding on the cherubs, but on the chariots, on the clouds. And so, God is riding around on these cherubs as well. And again, this makes sense because Islam is an outgrowth of the tradition of Judaism. It incorporates these traditions. And so to mock the Baroque tradition, and yet not to acknowledge the Christian traditions where you've got these miracles, taking place, speaking in tongues when you've never learned the language, things like that. And then to mock and not to mock the Jewish tradition where you've got talking donkeys and, Balaam arguing with his ass, literally, and, talking back to him and being smart with him and talking serpents, and to acknowledge one and not to acknowledge the other, to say that this one is clearly mythological, but these really happen. We call that special pleading. You can't do one and not the other. If you're going to be taken seriously as a scholar, if you're going to be taken seriously as someone who does critical method, if you're going to be an apologist and just make up the rules as you go and do all these mental backflips, yeah, you can do anything. You can make it up, right? If you're just making things up, you can do whatever you want.
Notice there's nothing about a flying donkey taking Muhammad to Jerusalem. Jerusalem isn't even mentioned. Later Muslims identified Al-Masjid Al-Aqsa as the Temple Mount, but this verse doesn't say any of that. Indeed, the verse doesn't even mention Muhammad. That was added by translators.
Very interesting observation, David, if this is the case.
In context, the night journey in the Quran sounds like it's talking about Moses. God took Moses from one place to another place and gave him the scripture to guide the children of Israel. Later Muslim sources claim that this is about Muhammad's night journey, but this later legend had nothing to do with Abdul Malik building the Dome of the Rock.
David, I hate to break it to you, man, but did you know that Christians claim that Jesus fulfilled the scriptures? In fact, they go so far as to say many of the texts in the Hebrew Bible, Old Testament, Jesus is there and it's speaking about him. From virgin birth to his suffering, the suffering servant, the list goes on and on. Now, of course, this has been well established that even Jewish authors did this when they looked at scriptures century, 2 centuries before the New Testament. But I hate to point it out. It needs to be done. That's exactly what the Christians did with the existing past scriptures they had. So if Muslims are doing this in this context, it wouldn't shock me. They learned a trick from Jews and Christians. Now, Dr. Cargill, David likes to practice textual criticism on the Quran, and even highlights in a section where Muhammad's name seems to have originally been absent, yet later scribes insert it. And it makes better sense based on his observations that Moses would have been better fit to be the described person that fits this context. And someone inserted Muhammad, creating the legend of Muhammad traveling to Jerusalem as a spit in Christian and Jewish faces, as usurping their religion and having the correct one themselves. So they invent this legend about him going to Jerusalem. Don't know how true that is, but I find it ironic that he can practice the textual criticism this way on the Quran, yet lacks that kind of practice on his own practice, his own religion.
Let's grant the literary critical analysis that this apologist is presenting. Let's concede it. I don't know if it's right. Let's just concede it. Look at all of the literary criticism that this apologist is willing to undergo with the Quran, with the Islamic scriptures. Is this same apologist willing to concede, willing to allow for Hebrew Bible scholars, for biblical scholars who are trained in this, who have given their entire careers to this, and not just me, lowly little me, the scholars under whom I trained and under whom they trained, 200 years of this, let's say 1,000 years of this, right? Is he willing to concede that that same kind of literary criticism can and has been done to the Christian New Testament, to the Hebrew Bible? Is he willing to allow for that to happen? My guess is no. So he's more than willing to allow for the critical analysis of the Quran and to speculate, no, it could be this and it could be this, and what if this is going on, and if you take this word out and if you change this word, the things that we as critical scholars do all the time, right? He's willing to do that to the Quran, but is this apologist willing to do that to the Hebrew Bible, to the Christian New Testament? And my guess is he then flips and he just goes into full defensive mode and says, no, that's not what's going on. So he's defending the Bible against that when it's done to the Bible, against scholars, but he's quick to do that when he wants to go on the attack, what he says go on the attack, or he wants to be critical against the Quran. And this is one of the things that I teach in my classes all the time, and that is confessional people that adhere to a faith tradition are very quick to insist that people of a different faith tradition read their holy text in a literalist manner. That is, let's say I was raised in a fundamentalist Christian tradition, right? Let's say I was just raised in a Christian tradition. I might be very quick to insist that whatever the Quran says, and I'll find the worst things that it might say, right? The most problematic things that the Quran might say. I might insist that every Muslim on earth reads that in the most fundamentalist, literalist manner. See, you have to believe this. You have to think, because that's what it says. It says what believes what it says believe what it says, right? And yet, when I read my own religious text and I see these highly problematic things, God committing genocide, commanding genocide, right? Commanding the killing of your own son type thing. Well, we don't do that anymore. That was then. That was nailed to the cross. That's not something we do anymore. And besides, that wasn't literal. That was just poetic. And slavery is not something we do anymore. That was back then. We don't do that anymore today. And so that's the issue that I talk about in classes. We tend to take the worst motives for people of another faith tradition, but when it comes to our own faith tradition, we are very liberal. We're very accommodating. And that's what seems to be going on here. He wants to apply this critical methodology to the Quran, but he doesn't want to apply that consistent critical methodology to the Hebrew Bible and to the New Testament. And that's where the fundamental methodological error takes place in his logic, in his thinking.
Dr. Cargill, as an expert when it comes to archaeology and talking to the experts in the field who are archaeologists, you know a lot about this place where the Temple Mount stands, we call Jerusalem. Let's go way, way, way back before Yahweh is even on the scene as a god of this place. What gods existed before this? Does the name Jerusalem give us any hint as to what we could expect if we were to travel back, 3,500 years ago, or sometime way, way back before Yahweh was on the scene? I guess what I'm getting at is, it seems Jerusalem, before Israel is on the scene and the Judahites or Judeans are in the south worshiping Yahweh and having a Jerusalem temple dedicated to Yahweh, they also usurped an existing holy site that was probably to a different god, repeating the same cycle that I think David Wood is trying to act like Muslims just stole it. Well, seems like everybody's been doing this kind of thing forever.
Yeah, this is a great question. As we know, Jerusalem, and I teach a history of Jerusalem class, you can date this city going all the way back to the 18th, 19th century. With the Egyptian execration text, we've got evidence of Israel from the Merneptah Stela, in Canaan, in Palestine. You've got references to Jerusalem as the capital city of Israel, going back to the 10th century, early 9th century. But of course, you've got these claims in the Bible that the Jebusites were there. Now, whether or not they existed, we can have a debate. But there was a claim that they took this city from someone else, meaning someone else was there and they had walls, they had a city, and presumably they worshiped somebody up on top of their mountain, right? Up on the top of this mountain. And presumably someone was worshipped there before that because, as we've said, holy places tend to remain holy. And so the question becomes, if this deity Yahweh was the deity that ended up being worshipped in the temple that was in Jerusalem once Israel established its kingdom and Judah at a later date, who was worshipped there before? And many scholars have suggested that the name Jerusalem itself is actually the Akkadian determinative, Uru, which means city. So if you put that little cuneiform symbol in front of the word Shalem, Uru Shalem, you've actually got city of Shalem. So if you see the word Shalem, you know it's not the deity Shalem, or otherwise you'd get a dinger. You'd get the determinative for a deity, for a god. So you're talking about the god Shalem, but this is the city Shalem, Uru Shalem. And I make a big chapter about this in my book, that in Melchizedek in Genesis 14, they're talking about Shalem being, there's a tradition that arises later in the late Second Temple period, that Shalem was an early nickname for Jerusalem. No, it wasn't. Because when you actually see it in the Amarna letters, it's got the determinative in front of the lengthy name Uru Shalem, Uru Shalem, right? So it was always this lengthy name. It was never just Shalem, but that's beside the point. The idea is that the city probably derived its name from the deity Shalem. And Shalem is a deity that we know about from the Ugaritic pantheon. It's a Canaanite deity. There's Shahar and Shalem. Sometimes it gets translated as sunrise and sunset, or these are two deities, twin deities. We find a plaque, by the way. We've been finding this plaque. We found one at Tel Azekah. You've got them at, I think, Rephaim. You've got them at locations throughout Israel, especially in the Shephelah, where you've got this mother nursing twins at the breast, and she's holding them both and she's nursing them. And some scholars think that this is a plaque of some sort that's commemorating these two deities, Shalem and Shahar. Not everybody agrees with this, but this is one of the traditions, because Shalem was the name of a deity. Shahar was the name of a deity. And so some scholars have suggested that Jerusalem got its name because the deity Shalem was worshipped there. So Shalem was the deity that was worshipped. Others have suggested that the deity Zedek or Zedok was some kind of Zedok thing, because you have so many names theophoric names with the name Zedok are there. So maybe the deity Zadok was worshipped there. What we know is that Yahweh probably wasn't the first deity worshipped at Jerusalem, or whatever its name was prior to that. And so, again, temples, holy places tend to remain holy no matter what it was, and the names of the deities change over time. And so there was probably a deity worshipped there before Yahweh. It was probably not the same deity. Maybe it was El, maybe it was Shalem. We don't know, but that's the presumption.
So for the viewer who may not be tracking, you're saying El was a different deity than Yahweh?
It was. El was. El, I describe him in Cities That Built the Bible. I describe El as the deity emeritus. So he's like the creator deity that sets everything up, and he's now like the chairman of the board. He handed things all over to Baal, and Baal is like the CEO who runs the thing, and he's like the chairman of the board. He's an emeritus. He's there for his reputation and for gravitas, and he's like, no, if you got anything to say it to Baal. He's running the show now. It's like Vito Corleone in Godfather 2, right? He's retired or semi-retired, and anything you got to say, go say it to Michael. But he's still kind of a big deal, but he's not running everything now. So El is the first original deity, and then he has all these other deities, and they kind of take over the show. But what's going on in Canaan, all of these other deities, especially once the Israelites come in and start to tribe up and then coalesced together into this agreement of tribes that, it's kind of like, think about the early United States. It was basically these 13 states, these 13 independent nations that were held together by a continental land agreement, which was our early constitution. You basically had these tribes that were Canaanites. They were already there, but they had these different tribes, and they just kind of got together a little closer, and then they finally formed this agreement, this confederation, where they would, when they needed to, defend themselves against their neighbors outside of Canaan. They would come together and rise up and create an army, and then they would disband that army when the threat went away. And this is what you read about in the book of Judges. Now, how real the book of Judges, how historical it is, we can have a debate about. But that seems to be these Canaanites, these Israelites were Canaanites. They were always there, and they just kind of slowly banded together. But they probably worshipped all these different deities. But what Mark Smith argues and Thomas Romer argues in their respective books is that as they gravitated towards the worship of Yahweh or Yahu, as they worshiped towards this southern deity, and that became the central deity, the deity that kind of became the national, if you want to use that word, that deity, that instead of just getting rid of these deities, they incorporated El, they incorporated Baal into the persona of Yahweh. And so when you read El in the Bible, they just say, oh, no, that's not a foreign god. That's just another name for Yahweh. And sometimes when you read Baal, it's just the word for Lord. And Lord, of course, is our Lord. And other times when you read Baal, it's a foreign deity and we don't like him. So sometimes in the Bible you read Baal and Asherah, and that's the gods that we used to worship. We don't like those guys anymore. And sometimes when you read El, it's just another El Shaddai, right? Or El Elyon. That's just Elyon is a deity, and El is a deity, and it's is it the Sephira inscription, or is it in Ugarit? You have Elyon. It's got a vav in there. It's two deities, El and Elyon, but it becomes God Most High, or it's El Elyon, God Almighty, or something, and they just all become Yahweh. And so that's how they handled it. It's just, everything gets. It's that giant second sound, as Ross Perot used to say, and they all kind of like a black hole, and they become Yahweh, and he becomes the deity.
Thank you so much, Dr. Cargill, for your time, your expertise, and helping educate us on a little bit of history to broaden our perspectives from pointing fingers and not recognizing they point back at us. I think there was an old saying that when I point my finger, that there's three pointed back at me, which I think represent these three fingers. Anywho, I'm looking at this and I appreciate you. I hope our viewers do as well, broaden their perspectives. I hope they'll subscribe to your YouTube channel, get a copy of your books, and potentially, if you're going to college in America, go to your college and learn a thing or two about this.
Go Hawks! University of Iowa, we're always looking for undergrads that want to come here and study the Bible, and grad students, of course, if you want to come study biblical studies and classics with me. You're all welcome. And thanks for having me today. I appreciate it.